My name is Hannah Doughty. I am the Supply Chain Account Manager for GSMA and their work with CDP's Supply Chain Programme. And I'm here in a hosting capacity today because we have some fabulous speakers lined up for you. So these are our speakers who will be taking you through today's agenda. We are very lucky to have everyone on board. First up, we have Stephen Moore. He is the Head of Climate Action for GSMA. And he, of course, quite a number of you will have come across him. He has been working very hard on setting standards of leadership for the industry. So he will be giving you some big picture context on the sector to set you up for the rest of the presentation on science-based targets. And that science-based targets material will be covered by Lea Fink. She is the European lead for the Commit to Action team at CDP, and she is essentially our direct line into initiatives like the SBTI and also to RE100 Business for 1.5 campaign. So she'll be sharing some of her knowledge with you. And then last but not least, we have the wonderful Veronika Thieme. She is a consultant at the Carbon Trust, and she is stepping in for Andy Stevens because unfortunately he was unable to make it. She has worked very closely on the guidance that GSMA has produced for the Carbon Trust, and so she is your expert for that section and the ICT sector pathway work as well. So I will pass over to Stephen to get started on that industry piece. Stephen, let me know when you want me to move the slides and move them forward.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah, and hello everyone. So the mobile industry commitment to climate action. So this started at the GSMA level, at the GSMA board level last February in 2019, and the GSMA board committed to take climate action by helping the mobile industry work on a path to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then to align our climate targets accordingly. So the process for achieving this was agreed to be, firstly, to focus on members' climate disclosure. So we've been working very closely with CDP on this, and we did a knowledge call around TCFD around a month ago. The next step was actually calculating and agreeing what the mobile industry pathway to zero emissions would be. So that's net zero by 2050, and that's aligned to the 1.5 degree warming scenario, which is in the Paris Agreement. And the third step, therefore, is to get members to align their emissions targets, ideally with the new mobile industry pathway to net zero. And that's why we're here today, to talk about how to align your science-based targets to the new industry pathway. So if we move on to the next slide. So how have we been doing against these three areas over the last year? So firstly, in terms of climate disclosure, there's been a really fantastic response from across the industry, and more than 50 mobile operator groups actually disclosed their climate risks to CDP last year, and we're hoping to have the same, if not more, disclosed this year. And in total, these operator groups covered 2/3 of global connections, so it's a really significant step change and covering a majority of the industry. The next area was around agreeing the industry pathway to net zero emissions. And this was through a consortium of the ITU, GSMA, GESI, and SBTI. And Veronika will talk more about that in detail later. But this was agreed and approved in February of this year. And the guidance covers mobile operators, fixed line operators, and data centers operators as well. And then the third area is around target setting. And already there are quite a number of mobile operators that have committed to or set science-based carbon reduction targets. So in total, these operators have a combined revenue of more than $600 billion. So that is a really fantastic signal to an economic signal that companies are really getting behind science-based targets and really looking to reduce their emissions at the level that we need them to be reduced. So if we move on to the next slide. So here is an overview of all of the operators, or at the latest count, it does change quite regularly, who have committed to science-based carbon reduction targets. And the first step is to commit, and the second step is to then calculate and set your science-based target and get it verified by the Science Based Target Initiative. So before we go into the detail of how to calculate and set your science-based target, I'll hand over to Lea to give a bit more information around the Science-Based Target Initiative and what it's looking to achieve and how it's working to achieve that.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and also hello everyone from my side. Yeah, as Stephen said, before we will have Veronika really deep diving into the details of the ICT pathway, I'm happy to give you an overview on the Science-Based Targets Initiative and what we do, and a short general introduction on science-based target setting. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a joint partnership between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, WWF, and the World Resources Institute, and was founded in 2015. So we're celebrating our 5th birthday this year, with the objective to provide a framework for companies to align themselves with what's needed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. So essentially to align themselves with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we now have almost 900 companies that have formally joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And out of these, we have 365 companies that went through the target validation process. So they have gotten their targets officially approved by the initiative and public on our website. So what are science-based targets? Assuming that most of you are already aware, but just to set a common ground, I quickly walk you through that again. So science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reductions that are consistent with the level of decarbonization that is according to the most recent climate science required to keep global temperature increase within 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial temperature levels. So if we look at that graph here, and knowing that the science is clearly telling us that we need to reduce emissions, or we need to reach a net zero economy by the second half of the century, so by 2050. So we have that long-term goal, and then we have science-based targets as short to medium time frame targets spanning over 5 to 15 years, providing companies with this clear pathway, quickly defining how quickly and how much to reduce emissions in order to be on track to reach this long-term goal. And annual disclosure and generally climate reporting that Stephen also talked shortly about earlier. So also great to hear that there's such great progress in the sector already. So annual disclosure plays an important role here of or by showing to all your stake and shareholder that you are moving into this direction and that you're integrating climate change into the strategy and into day-to-day decision making. The process to join the initiative starts with a public commitment letter, which is a document where companies state that they develop science-based targets within 24 months. And this step is not obligatory, however, encouraged to really show that this is that journey that you're starting and this is what you're working towards. And then in that development phase, so where you develop your targets, this is really where a lot of these guidance and resources and tools that are out there come into play here. And this is where you will, of course, have a great resource at hand with the new ICT sector pathway and related guidance. And then once the targets are ready, companies submit them to the Science Based Targets Initiative for an official validation, and then we check whether these targets meet our criteria, and if they do, they are approved and publicly announced on the website. You can also see all already publicly approved targets by your peers, for instance, on the website. Now I want to quickly walk you through the key components behind the science-based targets, so the most important elements, and we will hear more about that later on. So I'll just give you a quick overview. It always starts with this global carbon budget, so asking ourselves, how much can the world economy still emit? And that budget is also, or the resulting emission reduction pathways are depending on the long-term temperature targets that we are working towards and that we're targeting. And as the IPCC special report on 1.5 sent a very clear message that we do have to reach net zero by 2050 and halve emissions by 2030 and really engage on that 1.5 pathway. This is what we highly encourage companies to work towards. And the second step is then to choose the method to calculate your targets, where the Science Based Targets Initiative generally for Scope 1 and 2 target setting accepts two methods, the absolute-based approach or absolute construction method, as well as the sector-based approach. And then the third bucket here is your company's specific profile. So where are your emissions located and how much will your business grow? All these elements will define how your individual science-based target will look like. To give you an overview of the science-based targets criteria, I start with the level of ambition. So as I said, we do very much encourage companies to align their targets with a 1.5 degree future. We do, however, also accept a minimum level of ambition for Scope 1 and 2 and targets a well below 2 degree alignment, knowing that it is harder for some sectors than others, depending, of course, on also the emissions profiles to decarbonize within the next 5 to 15 years. Even though on the long run, all sectors essentially working towards the same direction. Then the second very important criteria is the forward-looking ambition. So companies' targets need to be meeting the ambition criteria over the full forward-looking time span of their target. Scope 1 and 2 targets need to cover at least 95% of overall Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The time frame that we generally accept are 5 to 15 years into the future. And we ask companies to annually disclose their greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And then we also ask every company to conduct a full Scope 3 screening. And if that screening shows that the Scope 3 emissions portion is significant, then we ask companies to set an ambitious and measurable Scope 3 target aligned with one of our options that Veronika will explain you in a few minutes. And we define that significance threshold with 40% of total emissions. So companies need to set a Scope 3 target if their Scope 3 portion is higher than 40% of the overall emissions. And this list is not extensive, so we do encourage you to look at the full SBTi criteria when you're working towards your target submission. And lastly, I want to invite you to join a campaign that we've launched last year, which is called the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign, a joint effort by Science Based Targets, the Women Business Coalition, and the United Nations Global Compact to work with companies to commit to the highest level of leadership and to align their emission reduction goals with a 1.5 degree future through ambitious science-based targets as well as long-term net zero goals. And over the past few months, we've seen great progress by companies across a variety of sectors and geographies joining the campaign. We now, I think, have 211 companies that have committed to 1.5 degrees through the campaign. And you can also, again, see that GSMA and associated members are demonstrating a very high degree of leadership here with a very, very great representation of, on the side, for instance, a telecommunication company. And if you do want to learn more about that campaign, please consult our website and get in touch with us. We're very happy to walk through this with you together and assess how that would look like for your company. All right, that's it from me. Thank you. And I'm handing over to Veronika.
Great, thanks, Lea. So hi to everyone online. So my name is Veronika Thieme. I work for the Carbon Trust as a consultant, focusing to a large extent on companies in the ICT sector. So today I'm going to start by very quickly just introducing the Carbon Trust, and then I will talk about the new ICT sector guidance and how companies can use this to set science-based targets for themselves. So first of all, who's the Carbon Trust? So the Carbon Trust is a not-for-profit mission-driven organization, and we work with companies, governments, and public sector bodies to help them measure, manage, and reduce their carbon emissions with the overall mission to sort of accelerate the move towards a low-carbon economy. We were set up around 20 years ago and now have a sort of worldwide team of experts working across many different areas. And we also have a very strong science-based target team. And so far, we've worked with over 85 companies to help them set science-based targets. As Lea mentioned, the SBTi have a sort of set of general criteria that companies should use to set science-based targets, but there are also a number of sort of sector-specific requirements for certain industries that have been developed for sectors like transport, for example, which use primarily energy and emission scenarios and forecasts from the International Energy Agency, so the IEA data. However, as the ICT sector only makes up around 2% of global emissions, which is, while still significant, relatively small compared to other sectors, the IEA data does not include a separate pathway for the ICT sector. So as a result, the GSMA, the ITU, and GESI decided to collaborate and together with technical support from the Carbon Trust, put together a sector-specific approach for setting science-based targets for this sector. And so this ICT sector-specific approach for setting science-based targets was summarized in a guidance document, which was reviewed and approved by the SBTi and published in February of this year. So this guidance document is available on the websites of all three of these organizations, and the GSMA has also put together a more practical sort of step-by-step guide that you can access as well. So I'm now going to give you a quick overview of the ICT sector approach for setting science-based targets, but please be aware that these guidance documents are available should you require any additional information on these topics. So the ICT sector approach that was developed through this collaboration was based on the ICT sector decarbonization pathway published by the ITU as part of the recommendation LTU, the L1470, and this pathway is aligned with the Paris Agreement by following a 1.5 degree global decarbonization trajectory. The pathway focuses only on the decarbonization pathway for Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the ICT sector, so the emissions associated with the own operations of ICT companies, which is why the ICT sector approach also focuses mainly on Scope 1 and 2 science-based targets, while Scope 3 targets then follow the general SBTI guidance for setting Scope 3 targets. So the overall ICT sector pathway that was developed was then split into 4 different subsectors that you see here, which is the mobile telecoms subsector, fixed telecoms, a data center pathway, and also a sub-pathway for the ICT equipment manufacturers. And the reason for sort of splitting out these subsector pathways is that each of these have their sort of unique challenges when it comes to decarbonization and therefore require their own pathway. So one key thing to note is that while the subsector pathway for ICT equipment manufacturers was included in the work done by the ITU, there's ongoing work to include this into the SBTI approved sector approach for ICT companies, and I think the aim is to have this completed later this year. So on this slide, you can see what these individual subsector pathways look like, with the overall pathway in green at the top, starting from a baseline of 2015 and going out all the way to 2030, and then followed by the individual subsector pathways. Again, all of these individual subsector pathways are aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory, and they were also compared to and checked against some other 1.5 degree scenarios that you can see at the bottom of this slide here, including the IPCC 1.5 degree scenario, the 1.5 degree absolute contraction scenario that was developed by the SBTI, as well as against some of the pathways from the IEA data as well. And so these pathways were derived first by developing a robust baseline for 2015, which required sort of the working out of the exact energy consumption for the sector and the associated carbon emissions. This was then combined with energy projections for the ICT sector all the way out to 2030. And these projections were based on and sort of incorporated the technological improvements and changes that are predicted to have an impact on the sector's energy consumption, like, for example, the rollout of 5G infrastructure, as well as potential energy efficiency initiatives through improvements in computing power, for example, and it also looked at changes in the types of sort of personal devices that are being used. And then finally, these energy projections were converted into carbon reduction trajectories by applying emission factors that are based on an electricity grid decarbonization pathway that was also aligned with 1.5 degrees. So once these pathways were derived, the next step was then to use these pathways to develop an approach that companies could follow to set their own reduction pathways that would be aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario. And so on this slide, you can see the 3 pathways for operator emissions and what Scope 1 and 2 reductions need to be achieved for individual companies over a 10-year period between 2020 and 2030. And so for mobile operators, they're required to reduce by 45%, fixed network operators by 62%, and 53% for data center operators. So these pathways only go out to 2030, and this is one area where the ICT sector guidance differs from the general SBTI guidance. As Lea mentioned earlier, the general guidance states that targets should be set for a 5 to 15-year time frame, whereas the ICT guidance states that targets need to be set at least 5 years out, but ahead of 2030. And this difference to the general SBTI criteria was introduced due to the sort of fast-changing nature of this sector. So this slide shows sort of the general reductions that are required for companies across different subsectors. And now I'll go into a little bit more detail about how you would then use this to calculate a company's specific target. So before we go into the details, let's look at the overall sort of process that would be required to set a science-based target. The first step is to measure your Scope 1 and 2 baseline, which should follow the GHG Protocol corporate accounting standard, and also consider the sort of different approaches for calculating your Scope 2 emissions. In line with guidance to calculate both a market and a location-based Scope 2 footprint. The next step will then be to calculate your Scope 1 and 2 target, which I'll talk about in a minute in more detail. And here, of course, it's recommended to use the ICT sector approach for setting science-based targets that we're discussing today, and also making use of the GSMA guide, which includes that step-by-step approach. Then once you've set a Scope 1 and 2 target, you then want to shift your focus to your Scope 3 emissions and start by measuring your complete Scope 3 impact. So developing essentially your Scope 3 baseline, which can then be used to set your Scope 3 target by using the sort of general SBTI criteria for setting Scope 3 targets. And then the final step, once you've confirmed your targets internally and they've been signed off, the next step is to get them approved by the SBTI through the validation process that Lea took us through earlier. So now, or for today, I'm going to focus on steps 2 and 4. So these are the sort of target setting processes. But if you are interested in learning more about some of the other steps, there is further information available in the GSMA guide. And of course, also feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A bar so we can discuss them at the end. So when it comes to setting your Scope 1 and 2 target, what are the steps that are involved? So first, you want to define the boundary of what needs to be included in your target. And for your Scope 1 and 2, you shouldn't be excluding more than 5% of your total footprint. And as mentioned earlier, it needs to be aligned with the GHG Protocol. Next, you then want to define a baseline and a target year, followed by then allocating your Scope 1 and 2 emissions to the individual ICT subsectors. So this can sometimes be a bit tricky, as some companies might just have activities in one area, while others may have operations that go across different subsectors. And then the next step is to calculate the reductions required for the individual operations in each subsector by applying subsector reduction percentages, which can all be found in a table in the guidance document. So this contains the reduction factors for each subsector and also for each baseline and target year. And then the final step, once you've done that at each subsector level, you would then add up the absolute reductions required across each subsector for your company to get the overall, to then get your overall company's science-based target. So on this slide, we've just given an example of how this would work in practice using a company that has both fixed and mobile operations. So in this example, the company has decided on a baseline year of 2019 and a target year of 2025. And the emissions from their mobile operations are 250,000 tons of CO2e, and their fixed network emissions are 150,000 tons. And to make things easier, they've decided to sort of combine all of their network-related emissions with their non-ICT-related emissions, so emissions from their offices and fleet, for example. And then if you look at the calculations at the bottom, so the emission reduction factor for mobile operators between 2019 and 2025 is 0.794 and 0.652 for the fixed operations. So if you multiply these by the emissions for each subsector and then add them together, you can work out that in 2025, this company needs to have reduced their emissions by around 26% in order to achieve a Scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint that equates to around 296,000 tons of CO2e. And that would be their Scope 1 and 2 target. So before we move on to Scope 3, we thought it'd be useful just to mention a few things to consider when setting a Scope 1 and 2 target for the ICT sector. The first thing to mention is that geographical differences are not taken into account for the current ICT sector approach. That doesn't mean that it isn't recognized that there are significant differences between regions and countries, particularly when it comes to things like renewables or availability of renewables and the electricity grid factors. But the sort of lack of a regional breakdown is actually something that is consistent across all sectoral approaches. However, this doesn't mean that there isn't any potential to incorporate these differences into the ICT sector approach in the future. Although these additions would then also need to follow sort of any generic development of methodology by the SBTI. Another thing to note is that the ICT sector approach takes an absolute approach rather than an intensity approach, and this is the case for two reasons. The first reason is that there is not one intensity metric that could be defined, which would adequately sort of capture the production output of the ICT sector. And then the second reason is that the standard SDA approach, on which this approach is based, requires a convergence of all company intensities by 2050, as well as zero emissions by 2050. And so mathematically, it would then be the same as following an absolute approach. However, while the sort of overall approach requires absolute reductions, companies are still able to express their targets using an intensity metric that's relevant to their business, as long as the sort of absolute reductions are still in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory. And then the final point on this slide, which was already touched on in the example calculation, is that many ICT companies will have non-ICT related emissions, and these will often be small compared to network related emissions, but nevertheless they need to be included in your target. And so the recommendation here is to account for these activities by combining all of their Scope 1 and 2 emissions and deriving a single science-based target using the ICT sector approach. So that was an overview of how companies can set Scope 1 and 2 targets using the ICT sector approach. Now moving on to Scope 3. So as mentioned before, for Scope 3, there is no ICT-specific guidance. So companies are required to follow the general SBTI guidance, and this states, as Lea mentioned earlier, if your Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of your total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so your entire value chain, you are required to also set a Scope 3 target. Now, from our experience, most MNOs will have Scope 3 footprints that will meet that threshold. and so therefore they'll be required to also set a Scope 3 target in addition to their Scope 1 and 2 target. So once you've determined that you need to set a Scope 3 target, the next thing is just to decide what should be included in your target. And here the guidance says that it doesn't necessarily have to cover all 15 Scope 3 categories. It could only cover a few, as long as together the emissions that are covered by the target make up at least 2/3 of your total Scope 3 footprint. And so typically the two categories that will most likely be included for an MNO to meet that 2/3 threshold are the emissions from your purchased goods and services, so category 1, and the emissions from the use of your sold products, which is category 11. So once you've defined what should be included in your target boundary, the next step would then be, similarly to sort of your Scope 1 and 2 targets, to select your base year, your target year, and then, of course, choose the approach for calculating your target. So while there aren't that many options for calculating your Scope 1 and 2 target, there are a few different options for setting a Scope 3 target. The first approach is to set an absolute reduction target that is in line with a below 2-degree trajectory. The next approach is to set an economic intensity target. This requires essentially a 7% yearly reduction in emissions per value added. The third option is a physical intensity reduction that requires a 2% yearly reduction in emissions per your chosen physical intensity metric. And the additional requirement there is that it also shouldn't lead to any increase in your absolute emissions. And then the final approach is to set a more qualitative supplier or customer engagement target. If you choose to set an engagement target, you would then essentially need to get enough suppliers or customers that make up at least 2/3 of your Scope 3 emissions and get them to set a science-based target within the next 5 years. This is different from the other three approaches where the time frame is still sort of 5 to 15 years from when you submit to the SBTI. So these are the 4 different approaches that you can choose to set a Scope 3 target, but you can also choose to set a target that combines these approaches. The most likely Scope 3 target that we would see MNOs setting is either an absolute target for both categories 1 and 11, or a combination of an absolute target or a supplier engagement target for your category 1, together with either an absolute or customer engagement target for category 11, so the use of sold products. So one relatively recent development that you should be aware of, especially if you choose to set an engagement target that includes SMEs, is the new route for SMEs to set science-based targets that has just come out by the SBTI and which will come into force from mid-July this year. This process aims to simplify the science-based target setting process for SMEs by having predefined options for Scope 1 and 2 targets. And in addition to that, for Scope 3, SMEs are only required to commit to measuring and reducing emissions without any strict requirements to set a quantified target. So it still requires them to consider their entire value chain impact, but without imposing too great a burden on them. So once you've set your target, the next big question then is how you will be able to meet that target, especially as the 1.5-degree trajectory is a challenging one, which will require significant changes across many different operations. So some of the key things that will be crucial in meeting these targets, one of them is, of course, to continue implementing energy efficiency plans across networks, especially with sort of new technologies coming in, but also investing in energy efficiency improvements across your non-ICT operations. So investing in electrifying your fleet and investing in low carbon offices. Another important thing will, of course, be a continuous move to renewables. Now, this can be achieved by purchasing renewable certificates, signing PPAs, or by investing in on-site renewables. Renewables are also an important aspect to consider for your Scope 1, as they'll be crucial to sort of replace some of your Scope 1 fossil fuel emissions. But in addition to sort of looking at your own operations, your Scope 3 target will also require you to consider the impact across your entire value chain. And this will require you to engage your end consumers by making them more aware of their purchases and educating them on how they can reduce the in-use emissions of your products. And it's also about engaging your supply chain. Whether you set an engagement target or not, you will need to engage your suppliers to reduce their emissions. And one of the main ways of potentially achieving this will be through industry engagement and also collaborating with other ICT companies. So one crucial element for decarbonization in the sector that I just touched upon is the importance of renewable electricity sources and the decarbonization of the grid. And the graph on this slide shows the overall ICT footprint without factoring in a decarbonization of the electricity emission factor and compared to the ICT 1.5 degree trajectory that does factor in grid decarbonization. And as you can see from the big gap between the two pathways, the grid decarbonizing is really, really important to being in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And while as an electricity purchaser, you will benefit from grid decarbonization, it's also important that you take a lead and create the demand that will ensure that the grid continues to decarbonize in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. And so at this point, I'll quickly hand back over to Lea to talk a little bit more about how companies can take action in the space of renewables.
Thank you, Veronika. Yeah, this links very nicely to what you just described, both in terms of the role of renewable electricity for companies to reach their own emission reduction targets, but as well the role that they can play in driving the further development of renewable electricity markets. So I quickly want to speak about the RE100 initiative, which is a joint initiative by the Climate Group and CDP, which is uniting now 232 companies globally that are committed to source 100% renewable electricity before 2050. And renewable electricity, of course, generally energy demand plays, of course, an important role for the ICT sector, as well as for many other sectors. And generally, businesses account for the majority of the global electricity consumption, and the resulting potential to demand renewable electricity can and should be an essential driver of the energy transition and achieving a zero carbon economy. And this is exactly what the initiative is trying to do. So we're bundling this corporate demand for renewable electricity and then bring it to policymakers as well as the power generation sector to create a more enabling environment and to really help as well to, for instance, bring into place national policies to mature local renewable electricity market mechanisms. And on the other hand, linking back to that other aspect, so more the company internal aspect, RE100 initiative has a lot of benefits for companies that are already sourcing renewable electricity or wanting to source more, because that commitment to move towards 100% is not only very attractive from a communication perspective, as it is clear to communicate that this is the path that is taken, but it also, from a reporting side, adds a lot of accountability to your path towards sourcing more renewable electricity. So this is a great way to join a leadership initiative, basically fostering the robustness of your renewable electricity targets. And furthermore, you get access to peer learning opportunities and technical expertise to accompany you on that journey and be together with other leaders in that field, potentially facing similar challenges as your own company. And to join, companies set a target that needs to be before 2050, but we can see from the 232 members that the majority of companies go for a target year between 2025 and 2030. And we also have a lot of ICT companies committed already. So again, an encouragement to go on our website, in this case, re100.org, where you can see other companies that are committed and what they have committed to exactly and how they're planning to get there. And then another requirement is to demonstrate annual progress and report annually as well on your sourcing instruments. That's it on RE100. With that, I will hand back to Hannah. Thank you very much.
First one might be equally addressed to Stephen and then also to Lea. It was just someone asking if we can please go over the approaches, mainly the absolute contraction method, that was posted at the start of the webinar. So I'm hoping that the sector deep dive into that method was helpful. Do you have anything to add on the subject of absolute contraction and sector methods?
Hi, it's Stephen here. It might be useful, actually, I see it's Shahad who asked that, if there is a follow-up question that you have specifically about that I think Veronika would be best placed to answer. So if there is a follow-up question specifically around the absolute contraction method, please let us know and we can answer it.
Great. And the other question, again, for Stephen, someone asking if it's possible to invite an operator that's already successfully set a target to perhaps share their experience, maybe see how this works out in practice. Is that something we could consider?
Yes, that's a really good idea. I'm happy to do that. I can look and speak to the operators that have set a target. It would be good to have one that set a target aligned to the new sector pathway. I will have to find out if any of the operators have done that yet, because the new sector pathway is very new. So we only had it approved in February. But yes, leave that with me and I will follow up on that one.
Excellent. I don't have any other questions that have come through to me. Did any other panelists have ones that were sent to them privately?
I just had a general question which might be best for Lea or Veronika, actually, which was around quite a few of our members are thinking about committing to a science-based target, but are not sure how they will achieve that science-based target. So what would you advise for those members in that situation who are thinking about it but are not quite sure?
Yeah, maybe I can start answering that. So I think, as I sort of mentioned earlier in my presentation, I think it's recognized that these are particularly challenging targets. So the first thing to note is that you're not alone in this, and a lot of your peers will be in a similar situation and there's definitely industry challenges that will need to be addressed to get to a point where we're sort of 1.5 degree aligned. One thing I would suggest would be to sort of do a feasibility assessment in conjunction with your science-based target setting. So really to look at what are the reduction initiatives that we've got currently in place or that we are planning in the near future, looking at things like purchasing of renewables and on-sites, and sort of looking at the whole package and seeing where does that get to, and then identifying the gaps within your footprint, and looking at essentially what needs to happen for you in order to close that gap between your footprint and your target. So that's the sort of other thing that I would just note.
Thank you. Lea, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that was a very good overview on the first, let's say, also practical steps that companies should take, just from an overall, let's say, commitment perspective. Just to note that these public commitments are also made or thought as a statement that you're working towards this goal. And the nature of science-based targets, like we've heard several times today, is that a company is committing to do what is necessary, right? So to do their share. And this, we know this is necessary, and companies might be wanting to get there, but as Veronika said, for instance, not having the full footprint ready, or being in very different stages along that journey. And we do encourage companies to be, let's say, already proud to start that journey and publicly commit.
That's great, thank you. I had another question, which I know some members have been discussing, and that is around Scope 3 emissions, which can be kind of difficult to measure. So I wondered whether Veronika and Lea, you had any advice or maybe tools. I think we do point them towards some in the guidance, but it might be worth reiterating to support members when they're looking to calculate their Scope 3 emissions. What would you advise for that particular area, which we know is quite tricky?
Do you want to start, Veronika?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and then maybe Lea, you can talk about sort of what the requirements are from the SBTI around Scope 3 measurement. So I think Scope 3, again, it is a difficult area, and it is difficult to measure and to collect all of the data to accurately calculate your Scope 3 emissions. I think the key thing is just to start looking at sort of what data you've got, and creating an almost hotspot carbon Scope 3 carbon footprint that will allow you to sort of identify sort of where your hotspots are, and then focus in on certain areas or certain categories where you can then put in more effort to increase or improve the data accuracy going forward. The other thing just to note on Scope 3 as well, that it is, for most companies, it's sort of a work in progress. So don't sort of think that you have to, the first time you create your Scope 3 footprint, it has to be perfect, and you have to have all the sort of data available that you need to really have a detailed footprint. So do realize that it is a work in progress for most companies as well.
Yes, I can only second that from an SBTI perspective. This is exactly what we encourage companies to do, to see this as a journey, to start with a hotspot analysis, And from our perspective, it is absolutely acceptable as well to set a measurable, ambitious Scope 3 target based on a rather basic Scope 3 footprint, let's say, and then, as Veronika explained, see this as a constant improvement process. But from our perspective, companies can and should start that journey by setting a target, and that is already possible based on high-level screening across all Scope 3 categories.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. Just to follow up around the absolute contraction method question that was asked before. So how is that specific to the ICT sector in terms of the development of the pathway? Because obviously the absolute contraction method is applied to other sectors as well. So how is the one that we've got for our ICT sector and the mobile subsector, how is that specific to our particular subsector? Veronika, perhaps you want to explain that one.
Sure. So I guess there is the absolute contraction method that's accepted by the SBTI to set targets which is available for all companies in all sectors. And basically that is based on a global carbon reduction trajectory, and basically it requires all companies across all sectors and regions to reduce at the same rate over a specific time period. Then the approach that we talked about today, which is the ICT sector approach, I suppose in terms of how it's applied, it is also in a way similar to the absolute contraction method, but it is still a sectoral method because the reduction pathway is specific to the ICT sector and the reduction percentages are specific to the ICT sector. In addition to that, obviously you have that split into the ICT subsectors that you need to you sort of need to follow to work out your target. So I hope that sort of roughly explains the difference, but I'm sure we're happy to sort of follow up on that as well following the webinar if there's any further questions.
Thank you. And one final question. I know we are a couple of minutes over, just asking if we see an opportunity as an industry to engage in a comprehensive supply chain management model and to address suppliers collectively.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that one if you like, Hannah. So yes, there are a couple of things that the GSMA is doing around suppliers. So one is that I have entered the GSMA into the CDP supply chain program for the first time this year. So that is sending out a disclosure request to 80 of the largest suppliers across the industry. So we want to, first of all, encourage suppliers to start to disclose their carbon emissions. And following on from that, we would like them to then set science-based targets. And this will therefore help our members to achieve their science-based targets, because the supply chain, as we mentioned, is such a big part of operators' carbon emissions. So that's one thing. And then there's the other area we're working on is with an organization called the Joint Audit Corporation, which was pulled together of 17 operators, and they're engaging around 200 suppliers. So we're supporting them through an introduction to greenhouse gas reporting, which CDP is helping us with. And we're also looking to support them around setting science-based carbon reduction targets as well to those suppliers. So we're very conscious that the supply chain is a big issue, and we would like to do more in that particular area. And we're open to further suggestions of what more we can do going forward as well.
So I guess all that is left is to thank all of our speakers for giving us such a great overview, to thank you, the attendees, for giving up your time today, and to let you know that we'll be in touch with the recording and the slides, and I wish you all the very best.